The Politics of American Jewry. Michael Curtis. Jews everywhere have long been subject to the dialectical tension between particularism and universalism, best exemplified in Hillel's maxim, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am for myself only, then what am I?" In modern America, this tension continues in the self-declared Jewish attachment, disproportionately greater than that of any other white ethnic or religious group, to liberal principles in seeming contradiction to the community's increase in affluence, rise in occupational status, and more secure position in American society. In political terms, this Jewish attachment is manifested in the continuing alignment of a considerable majority of the community with the Democratic Party, the party for Jews of the New Deal and the urban immigrant. The present condition of Jews in America, and their political activism and disposition, raises the questions of whether there is an inherent Jewish dedication to principles of social justice, compassion, and civic virtue, as Reinhold Niebuhr suggested, and why the success and relative security of the community has hardly affected its attitude to political issues. In his brief, lucid, and cogently argued book, The Utopian Dilemma, American Judaism and Public Policy, Murray Friedman examines Jewry in post-war America in terms of traditional utopianism or romantic liberalism and pragmatic realism. Why has Jewish political culture been so oriented to the ideological left? Friedman suggests some answers. The heritage of biblical injunctions, as in Amos and Isaiah, against injustice. The tradition of tzedakah, the charitable righteousness that calls for aid to the poor. The advocacy of rational change to achieve legal equality and to end or minimize discrimination. The identification with liberalism, because Jewish emancipation resulted from liberals of the Enlightenment. Though Jewish law does not lead to any specific political consequences, Jewish history has emphasized community responsibility, charity, and welfare for poorer Jews. In modern societies, this communal charity has, in addition, extended to support of more general welfare and non-Jewish communal activity. But Friedman asks if a shift to the political right is not now required in America by the needs for order, openness, and freedom. This shift would emphasize particularistic, rather than universal, interests and the need for national ethnic self-identification. Friedman defines the utopian dilemma as the desire to deal with politics and power as it should be rather than as it is. It is time to examine whether the public policies advocated by many Jewish organizations on economic and social issues, the welfare state and civil rights, are now appropriate. Friedman's brief historical analysis closely follows that of Lucy Davidovich in her book On Equal Terms. In the golden age of American Jewry, from 1945 to the mid-60s, Jews moved up socially and economically in personal life, and were publicly prominent in movements for civil rights, social welfare, and international institutions, including the United Nations. In the following age of anxiety, the period of the last 20 years, divisive political issues, the race revolution, rising crime, desegregation, welfare reform, Vietnam, the bias in the UN strained American society. The civil rights movement became more militant and blacks took over leadership roles. Racial tension increased, and the former cordiality between Jews and blacks was troubled by the struggle over community control of schools and low-cost housing, the differences over quotas for hiring and promotions, and a startling increase in black anti-Semitism, illustrated in 1984 by the language of Jesse Jackson and Minister Louis Farrakhan. Friedman sees welfare policies flawed as they encourage dependence, not self-reliance. Social values deteriorated as individuals were not held responsible for their actions. Yet Jews have continued to support welfare programs in spite of the need to restore values such as personal responsibility, civic virtue, and respect for legitimate authority. Most Jewish organizations accept abortion and oppose prayer and Bible reading in the schools, though the rise of a new paganism is disturbing. Many of these groups pay more attention to violations of human rights by right-wing regimes associated. Michael Curtis is professor of political science at Rutgers University. Washington, Ethics and Public Policy Center, 1985, 125 pages. Page 53. With the United States, then, to the defects of other regimes, and usually oppose military action or increased military spending, though there is an obvious connection between American military power and the security of Israel. On a number of issues, the utopian dilemma means that real American Jewish interests are not served by Jewish idealism. Friedman concludes that a better balance should be established between universalism and particularism. Specifically, this entails a stronger national defense and more support for regimes friendly to the U.S. compassion, and the welfare state are not enough for present policy. It is inappropriate to argue that defense expenditure must be reduced to allow more money for the poor. Nor should there be blanket approval of the concept of separation of church and state, without recognition that this may sometimes be undesirable. Friedman admonishes those who ignore the fact that the strengthening of civil rights in the 1980s rests on economic growth and urban enterprise zones. Jews, disproportionately supporting programs to assist the disadvantaged and minorities, are still too prone to be nostalgic about their immigrant past. For Friedman, Jews have always been ambivalent about power, often making a virtue of powerlessness. But now, he believes the situation is changing. An increasing number of Jews is, and a larger number should be, now aware of the realities of power, support a strong defense and national security, and question the growth of the welfare state and the desirability of busing and abortion. A better balance is emerging between concern for society as a whole and a focus on what is good for the Jews. Friedman's analysis is dispassionate in character, inviting rational dialogue on the present and future direction of politics among Jewry. Should the affluent Jewish community move away from its liberal stance, and will it do so? Will an increasing number of Jews vote for Republican candidates? While caution in interpreting electoral behavior is always called for, recent studies do not indicate any significant change in Jewish voting or political opinions. Jews have disproportionately supported liberal political positions, including civil rights and the welfare state, and voted for Democratic candidates to a greater degree than have other white citizens. Since 1924, Jews have voted Democratic in all presidential elections, by about 25% more than the electorate as a whole. Though in 1980, according to one survey, Jewish support for Reagan was only 10 points less than that of other white citizens, this apparent shift, due largely to a negative vote against Jimmy Carter, was reversed in 1984 and again in the 1986 congressional elections. In the 1984 presidential election, Reagan did worse than in 1980 among only two groups, Jews and the unemployed, getting 31 to 35% of the Jewish vote. Jews remain the country's most liberal major white religious or ethnic group. Reagan did considerably worse among Jews than among non-Jewish voters of similar education and income. Exit polls in 1984 showed that 2/3 of all Jews, earning over $30,000 a year, voted for Mondale, compared with 1/3 of all Americans earning the same amount. In 1984, the fear of Christian fundamentalism, with its call for the dominance of Christian values in American society, and its attacks on secular humanism, weighed more heavily than the prejudicial statements of Jesse Jackson and Louis Farrakhan in Jewish voting decisions. Nevertheless, some shift to the Republicans has occurred. Preliminary studies of the 1986 congressional elections show that 70% of the Jewish vote, as in 1984, went to the Democrats, a drop from the 82% of 1982. All evidence suggests that Jews respond in contrary fashion to their economic and social status. In the 1970s, over 60% of college-educated Jews, and about 60% of Jews have attended college, described themselves as liberals, a far higher proportion than college-educated Protestants and Catholics. About 30% of non-Jews have attended college. Jews are more liberal than white non-Jews on the whole agenda of American politics, including state-supported welfare, civil rights, women's rights, civil liberties, and internationalism. Their voting pattern is affected less by issues of taxation and government spending than by those of anti-Semitism, quotas, school prayer, and the security of Israel. Part of the explanation for Jewish voting beyond attitudes on the specific empirical issues is the lingering conception by many of Jewish marginality and, despite their present economic and social situation, the discomfort of Jews in the non-Jewish middle and upper-class milieu. The Jewish opposition to fundamentalist Protestantism stems not only from the latter's dogmatic theology and attitude to social and cultural matters, but also from the religious right's seeming intolerance and threat to the cultural pluralism with which the Jewish community feels safe. This opposition has been sufficiently intense to overcome any awareness of the strong support of Israel by Reverend Jerry Falwell and his colleagues. Jews describe themselves as liberals by a 2-to-1 margin, a margin almost double that of non-Jews. The 1984 CBS News New York Times exit poll found that 60% of Jews, over half of whom earn more than $35,000 a year, compared with less than a third of the general population, approved of an increase in federal spending on the poor, compared with 40% of the general population. Similarly, the 1984 Los Angeles Times exit poll showed that 40% of Jews supported reductions in domestic items in the budget, compared with 59% of the total. Jews approved raising taxes to support welfare programs and reducing military expenditure to a greater. Page 54. Midstream, May, 1987. Greater degree than other whites. Surveys in the 1980s find that Jews are more likely than others to protect free speech and assembly, and to support tolerance for individual and group differences. Jews were the only white ethnic or religious group to support civilian police review boards in New York, to oppose the California referendum for changing the fair housing law, to vote in considerable proportion for black candidates for mayor in Chicago and Philadelphia, and strongly to support equal rights for women and homosexuals, and the right to abortion. They equally strongly oppose the evangelical intention to give religion a more prominent place in the public schools with prayers and the teaching of biblical creation. In international affairs, the Jewish attitude is more nuanced. The 1984 LA Times poll found that 59% of Jews, compared with 38% of the population, favored a nuclear weapons freeze, and 32%, compared with 38% of the population, supported a reduction in military spending. But the latter issue is, of course, complicated by Jewish support for Israel. Every poll shows that Jews approve by almost a 3-to-1 margin the position that the United States should maintain a strong military capacity in order to be a reliable military supplier for Israel. The role of Jews in American politics is unique in itself, let alone when considered in terms of its small percentage of the population. Jews exhibit greater interest and energy than others, vote in about double the proportion of the rest of the population, contribute about half the total funds going to the Democratic Party, and now a considerable amount to the Republicans, engage as activists to a disproportionate extent, and influence the intellectual political climate, mostly recently by neoconservatism. Jews are no longer poor or immigrants attached to liberal positions in general, and to the Democratic Party in particular, by economic considerations of class or by social and psychological marginality, from an objective point of view. Even if one grants that the sense of marginality has lasted longer than warranted, because of the Jews' historical pariah status, some explanation is still required for the political behavior of an affluent and highly educated community that seemingly runs counter to its class interests. In recent years, a number of writers, including Charles Liebman, Stephen M. Cohen, Paul Ritterband, and Calvin Goldscheider, have reviewed some of the reasons given for Jewish attachment to liberalism. All of these reasons can be analytically challenged. The usually accepted argument that the Jewish religious tradition is universalistic, cosmopolitan, stressing communal and individual concerns for the welfare of others and the ideal of social justice, does not dispose of the fact that ethnic particularism, nationalism, and political conservatism can also be found in traditional Judaism. Indeed, current voting studies show that Orthodox Jews are the least interested Jewish group in any application of tzedakah to the general population, oppose liberal positions on abortion, homosexuality, marriage, and divorce, strongly support religious schools, and voted 65 to 70% for Reagan in 1980 and 1984. The fact that the most observant Jews were also the most conservative and gave majority support to Reagan, while the least observant were the most liberal of all Jews, suggests that the liberalism of Jews may stem less from religious tradition and heritage than from secular radical and revolutionary ideologies of the 19th and 20th centuries, and from their political response to modernity. It is sometimes held that the Jewish desire to change the status quo can be traced to the feeling that their achievements have been insufficiently regarded by society as a whole. But the economic, intellectual, and cultural contributions of Jews in present-day America appear to be well appreciated, if measured only in official rewards and cognition. Moreover, those Jews who feel most ethnically subordinate are also among the least liberal. A third argument is the historical one, that the political right was opposed to emancipation, especially of Jews, and often favored the inculcation of Christian principles in social institutions. Jews thus owe their emancipation to the Enlightenment, to tolerant liberalism or concepts of socialist universalism, which have earned their support for integrating them in a more agreeable society. Again, there are problems with this argument. The first is that overt antisemitism has largely disappeared in the political right except among the lunatic fringe, and the typical conservative resembles the typical Jew in income and occupational status. The second is the reality, slow to be perceived by many, that antisemitism, sometimes in a direct form and sometimes related to anti-Zionism, is now mainly found in the political left, both nationally and internationally. Moreover, the pioneering studies of Edmund Silberner have led to a burgeoning literature indicating the strong presence of antisemitism in the socialist and communist camp, including both Marx and Proudhon, and most recently political and literary figures in the Soviet Union. In addition, the increase in antisemitism among blacks, especially the better educated, according to recent surveys, has troubled Jewish supporters of civil rights, and those who felt that differences over social questions, such as quotas, could remain confined to the intellectual and political level. The sociological principle that prejudice declines with higher education appears not to have been proven in this case. But in most issues the principle appears to hold. The high proportion of well-educated Jews and their significant occupational status have meant support for the agenda. Review essay, page 55, of The New Cultural Liberalism. Over 60% of college-educated Jews, compared with 43% of non-college-educated Jews, describe themselves as liberals. In a generally more educated population, liberalism has been more welcome, even chic, in realms such as those of academia and the media. Jews may often be in the forefront of this new politics, but behind them is a solid phalanx of non-Jews. At the same time, opposition to cultural liberalism has been manifested by less well-educated and lower-status Jews, as also by Protestants and Catholics, who are manual workers and not college-educated. Is political change beginning to take shape among American Jewry? One cannot, of course, talk of Jews as a monolithic entity. The Republican Party has increasingly attracted descendants of those German Jews who came to the United States before the wave from Eastern Europe in the 1880s, and now attracts the Orthodox with their belief in religious schools, attachment to Israel, and hostility to the Soviet Union. Minimally observant Jews appear to be the most liberal, while the most secular and assimilated, as well as the most observant, are among the most conservative. One must also be careful about defining the key political terms. Jews may support more defense spending because of Israel, may be more concerned about violent crime, and thus approve harsh punishment, and may continue to oppose quotas as a hiring principle and still see themselves as liberals. If political labels are to be attached to individuals, what priority then ought to be given to the different elements of liberalism, political, economic, social, and cultural, which are not indivisibly linked? Nor are all the elements of liberalism invariably endorsed by one particular political party. The general answer to the possibility of change in political identification depends on a number of factors. Jewish liberalism will continue, as Arthur Hertzberg suggests, if Jews are willing to act in disregard of economic interest, when the cause seems just. The definition of justice thus becomes crucial: equality of opportunity or equality of results, and the application to actual cases would stem from that definition. Much also depends on which candidates will lead the major parties and what priorities will be given to certain issues. The direction of foreign policy, changing political positions in the non-Jewish world, and the impact of neoconservatism. A democratic leader modeled on the greatly admired Hubert Humphrey would consolidate the Jewish vote. On the other hand, a Jesse Jackson or a Pat Robertson, playing a prominent role in their parties, would lead many to exit, all other things being equal. An increase in the neo-isolationism present in part of the Democratic Party is likely to disturb those concerned for the security of Israel. Emphasis on the question of quotas or affirmative action generally in the 1987 Democratic-controlled Congress, or on school prayer and the control of abortion in the last 2 years of the Reagan administration, or in the Supreme Court, may be persuasive for some. More open support of Israel by Christian fundamentalists may lead Jews one way. More overt support for the Middle Eastern oil countries by business interests close to the Republican Party may lead to the other. Will prosperous Jews still continue to feel more psychologically comfortable in the more diversified Democratic Party with its urban, non-Anglo-Saxon constituents than in the Republican Party, more akin economically, but dominated by a combination of rural, suburban, and middle-class Protestants? Are Jews, as Charles Liebman argues, more interested in integration and acceptance into American society, or in the values of Jewish group survival? The voice of neoconservatism has been potent, but for limited numbers and with divided impact. United in commitment to political democracy, academic and intellectual tolerance, a strong foreign and military policy, suspicion of the Soviet Union, and attachment to Israel, the neoconservatives have challenged some of the accepted wisdom about the welfare state and social policies. But they differ on voting habits and political dispositions, dividing in support for the major political parties. The uncertainty about future Jewish political inclinations and party alignment is perhaps reflected in the present Congress. In the House of Representatives, there are 29 Jewish Democrats compared with 4 Republicans. Both of the 2 Jewish state governors are Democrats. But the 8 Jews in the Senate are evenly split between the 2 parties, a symbolic manifestation of the unresolved Jewish tension. If not now, when will American Jews decide upon their political ethos? Page 56. Midstream, May, 1987.